Well, hello everyone. David Hunter here from the Scottish Studies Foundation, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for your company today for this, the first in our 2024 series of Scottish Studies Zoom Talks. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Laura Harrison, who joins us from Fife in Scotland, where she is Senior Cultural Resources Advisor at Historic Environment Scotland, the lead public body set up to care for Scotland's past. Laura is Canadian and obtained a BA from Brock University before moving to Scotland to study at the University of Edinburgh, where she earned her PhD, which examined modern commemorations of the medieval Scottish Wars of Independence. She has published papers on the topics of medieval history, commemoration and heritage, and has a forthcoming item on medieval Scotland on film. Laura is also co-founder of the Scottish History Network, which produces a regular digital digest highlighting news and events in Scottish history. Her talk today is called "It's Just a Statue to Some People," and looks at how commemorations cross boundaries within the Scottish diaspora. And so, Laura, thank you for taking the time to encapsulate many years of your research into your talk today. And now over to you.
Thank you so much, David. Let me just share my... All right, I think that should be sharing okay, but let me know, of course, if it's not working.
Well, I can see it, so it looks good to me.
A good start for sure. Great. Well, yeah, thank you again, David, for organizing this talk today. And thank you so much for everyone who is here today, for spending part of your Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, with me. So as David mentioned, I work for Historic Environment Scotland, and I think a lot of people don't realize that there are career opportunities in Scottish history that are outside of working at a university. So I thought I'd just take 2 minutes right at the start of my talk today to explain what a Senior Cultural Resources Advisor does before I get into the more research side of things. So as David mentioned, Historic Environment Scotland, or HES, is the lead public body set up to investigate, care for, and promote Scotland's historic environment. It's a big organization with a lot of different roles, but the most pertinent to me is that we are responsible for the care of over 300 properties that are in the care of the Scottish ministers. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Historic Scotland, and those are the sites that we look after. So that includes everything from Edinburgh Castle, Glasgow Cathedral, and Skara Brae, to some random standing stones in a field, which are no less significant than those other three I mentioned. And the team that I am in is essentially an internal consultancy for the properties in our care. And it's made up of historians and archaeologists who give expert advice on the properties. This work can be anything from advising on the impact of proposed works, to organizing community archaeology digs, to working with our interpretation team on new panels and guidebooks, to working with researchers studying our sites, and lots in between. As I said, I'm not actually here to talk about this, but rather some of the research that sort of was inspired by some research I did in my PhD. But I'm sure you'll be able to see how my previous research interests are relevant to my role today. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions about my current role, or indeed my talk, when we have time at the end. So just to go through the pictures, in the top left, that is Edinburgh Castle. I bet you didn't know there is indeed solar panels on top of Edinburgh Castle, but they were installed a couple of years ago. Luckily, that is a flat roof and quite a big parapet on the side, so you can't see them except for some very specific drone shots. Beside that, also on the top, is one of the community archaeological digs that I mentioned. So this one was at Hilton of Cadboll, which is about an hour north of Inverness, that we undertook in September of this year. Below that, bottom right, is at the Castle of Old Wick in Caithness, and it is two contractors who are pulling out a piece of medieval timber that we did dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating on to help us date that castle. And then beside that, the last picture is myself, and that is on top of Sweetheart Abbey in the Borders. So that is medieval cathedral that dates from the same time as actually lots of what I'm going to talk about in my talk. And yeah, it was all scaffolded for something, so that's me right at the tippy top of it. But back to the topic at hand today. So yeah, as mentioned, my talk today is loosely based on research that I did during my PhD, which I did finish just over 5 years ago at the University of Edinburgh. My thesis examined modern, by which I meant 19th and early 20th century, commemorations of the medieval Scottish Wars of Independence. So I've always been interested in how we think about and write about and celebrate events from the past in more modern times. My thesis focused on Scotland, but being Canadian myself and a product of the Scottish diaspora, I couldn't help but ask whether commemorations to the Scottish Wars of Independence exist outside of Scotland, and it turns out that they do. So in 1964, the Queen unveiled this statue of King Robert I, better known as Robert the Bruce, outside Stirling in Scotland. The statue was placed on the site of Bruce's most famous battle, the Battle of Bannockburn, which occurred in 1314. This battle was a key moment in the First Scottish War of Independence, which refers to the series of conflicts between 1296 and 1328, when the Scottish kingdom fought to remain autonomous from a powerful English crown. This 20th century statue commemorating Bruce's win at Bannockburn was sculpted by Charles d'Orville Pilkington Jackson. And Jackson is one of two names to remember in this talk. And it's one of the most well-known statues of Bruce. It's particularly noteworthy because Jackson, the sculptor, used actual measurements of Bruce's skull, which was measured when it was rediscovered alongside the rest of his body in Dunfermline Abbey in 1818. Less well known, at least in Scotland, is that Jackson produced 2 of these statues, and the second one resides in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So my talk will begin by examining the relationship between these 2 statues at the time of their creation, before I'll explore how these statues have created a connection between the cities of Stirling and Calgary. By considering these commemorations, as well as some of the other statues dedicated to the Wars of Independence that have been placed within the Scottish diaspora, I'll then reflect on how commemorations can both transcend and also reinforce modern national boundaries and also personal identities. So the person who is responsible for Calgary also having a statue of Bruce is Eric Harvey. So Harvey is the second of the 2 names to remember today. And he was a lawyer who struck it rich with oil investments in the late 1940s and was one of Alberta's most famous collectors, businessmen, and philanthropists. He was born in April 1892, a few hours down the road from Guelph in Orillia, Ontario. After moving to Calgary to work as a clerk in his uncle's law office, he obtained his law degree, though it was interrupted as he fought in the First World War. As mentioned, he made his fortune from investing in oil during the Alberta boom. By the time of his death, he had given away 88 million Canadian dollars, and in his will, he donated the remainder to the people of Alberta, most of which ultimately, along with his personal collection, formed the Glenbow Museum, the largest museum in Western Canada. The Glenbow Foundation was already active during Harvey's life, which is slightly confusing, but necessary to keep in mind as we attempt to unpick the timeline to figure out how these twin statues came to exist on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, I pressed the wrong button again, so give me 1 second. So I've put a little timeline at the bottom here to hopefully make things a little bit easier as we unpick this timeline. So in 1962, a public appeal was launched for £50,000 to transform the site of the Battle of Bannockburn in time for the 650th anniversary in 1964. This was led by the National Trust for Scotland, who still care for the site, and the sculptor Jackson and his proposed statue of Bruce on horseback featured heavily in the campaigning. The plan was to transform the battlefield into a national monument centered around the Boar Stone where Bruce apparently placed his standard ahead of the battle. It would also include a commemorative flagpole placed within a rotunda and an exhibition explaining the Scots' battle strategy. This picture is a bit of a spoiler because you can see that all of those things happened. So in the colored photo, you can see the Bruce statue just off to the right. There's the rotunda and then the flagpole in the middle. The following year, in 1963, Jackson undertook a North American tour showcasing the historical and technical problems involved in producing the new sculpture of Bruce at Bannockburn, particularly those measurements of his skull that were used in order for him to make the statue. One of the newspaper articles covering his visit explicitly said he is in Canada to encourage Canadian Scots to contribute to the King Robert the Bruce Memorial Fund. He began in Toronto and went on to Calgary and Victoria before continuing into the US. As I already mentioned, that statue at Bannockburn was revealed the following year in 1964 on the 650th anniversary of the battle. Queen Elizabeth unveiled the monument during a day of celebrations. One of the newspapers said the unveiling took place, quote, amid ceremonial banners, a sprinkling of tartan, and more Scots than actually represented their country on the field on that famous day, end quote, which I thought was a bit judgy of the newspaper. We then jump 2 years in our timeline to autumn 1966, when it was announced that a replica statue would be placed in Calgary outside the Jubilee Auditorium. It was a gift to the people of Alberta from Eric Harvey. It is clear from the coverage that this was seen as a celebration of the link between Calgary and Scotland. For example, quote, it gives form to a historic link between this city and the old world. Calgary has many connections with Scotland, including its name, end quote. In the same year, we get an explanation from the sculptor, Jackson, about how this came to be. He revealed that Harvey not only paid for the Calgary statue, but also the Bannockburn statue. Jackson said Harvey acquired a number of Jackson's works and particularly admired a photograph of a statue Jackson had made of Bruce on horseback while it was still in plaster. In 1963, Harvey invited Jackson to Calgary as part of that speaking tour that I mentioned, and Harvey agreed to pay a large sum for the Calgary statue, which was ultimately sufficient to cover the cost of both statues. Jackson also said, quote, it was part of the bargain that the second casting for Calgary was to be kept secret and that no other be made. And indeed, Jackson destroyed the cast after the second statue. So Harvey admired Jackson's work and decided that he wanted a statue for Calgary. Jackson was struggling to raise the funds for the Bannockburn statue, so a deal was brokered with Harvey essentially paying for both statues. This is backed up by an earlier article from 1957 that identifies the Glenbow Foundation, established by Eric Harvey, acquiring a small 31-inch statue of Bruce from the National Trust for Scotland in 1957. So that's presumably the figure Jackson referenced that Harvey was admiring. In addition, an article from a Scottish newspaper in 1961 outlining the appeal for the Bannockburn anniversary mentions Jackson and says, already he has an equestrian statuette of Bruce for Calgary, Alberta. So again, presumably that's that small one that Harvey had already acquired. In 1967, the Calgary statue was unveiled, and the matching statues were in place on both sides of the Atlantic. It's worth noting that 1967 was the year of Canada's centenary. I haven't seen anything that suggests this year was chosen purposely for the unveiling, but I think it is noteworthy. During his 1963 tour, Jackson actually inquired as to what plans Canada had for celebrating its 100th birthday in 1967. And on this, he said, if you want to mark anything permanently, the memorial should serve no useful purpose. It should be good for nothing but looking at. I'm still quoting Jackson here. Memorial halls, swimming pools, skating rinks, all eventually become run down, outdated, their original noble purpose probably forgotten. But if it's a great work of art, good for nothing but looking at, people will treasure it, end quote. Now, in a world increasingly considering the impact of public commemorations, especially statues, I'm not sure we'd all agree with Jackson's statement, but it does lead me to the first of several themes I want to consider in my talk today, and that is statues and controversy. It's interesting to me that both of these statues have been places of controversy from the beginning. During the unveiling of the Bannockburn statue, there was a lot of concern about protests from Scottish nationalists. As one newspaper article said, if any public tantrum was expected, oh, this is a quote, if any public tantrum was expected from the Scottish nationalists, there was nothing seen or heard, although they were represented. A member of the Scottish aristocracy conjectured that a sword, purporting to be that of the Bruce, had been brought today, quote, in case anybody gets cheeky, end quote. And I should note that we don't actually have any swords that are from the time of Bruce, but people certainly still thought that we did. Stickers in Gaelic were found on the flagstaff in the rotunda that said, translated to English, "We must put the English to flight again." An official from the National Trust quickly removed them. In Calgary, the announcement of the placement of the statue in front of the Jubilee Auditorium caused protests and even an appeal to the provincial government. The concern was that the statue did not fit within the location. They said, while the auditorium is of a modern design, the statue is of antique style and would have no functional right or reason to be on the auditorium grounds. A group of art students marched through downtown Calgary, protesting the statue for the same reason. Their leader said, the statue symbolizes war and the area around the auditorium should be indicative of the artistic nature of the building. It is very unlikely that the sculptor responsible for the statue of Robert the Bruce ever considered the statue to be either a decoration for the Auditorium Hill or a symbolic link between Calgary and its Scottish heritage, end quote. Which is an interesting quote because we actually know how involved the sculptor was with Eric Harvey and probably where he was intending to place the statue as well. The article went on to say, which I thought was interesting, about the only comment heard during the protest was, "Who's Robert?" The statues, as places of political statements, continue to this day. The 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, taking place about 3 months before the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, essentially turned into a rally for the pro-independence yes campaigners. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd, the statue at Bannockburn was graffitied with Black Lives Matter and Racist King. In Calgary, though I don't know of any incidents specifically targeting the statue of Bruce in more modern times, it is part of the wider conversation about whose history public art is telling within the city. And this leads me to my second theme, which is about how the statues showcase the links between Scotland and Canada. It relates to a question you may be asking, which is why Harvey wanted to build a statue of Bruce in Calgary in the first place, other than his appreciation for Jackson's sculptures. And that is, frankly, a question without a clear answer. As I mentioned, the general explanation given is that it was to highlight connections between Scotland and Canada. Calgary is indeed named after a bay in the Isle, or off the Isle of Mull in the Inner Hebrides, though there is no indication of how this relates to Bruce, as he was likely never there, nor indeed that the place was even called Calgary in the Middle Ages. However, in a chapter by Robin Reid on Harvey, she ties the statue to Harvey's wider interest in Scotland, which was potentially inspired by his friendship with Robert Weatherspoon, who was the mayor of Inverness at the time, and also a significant promoter of tourism to Scotland. Incidentally, and I can't resist telling the story, Weatherspoon claims to have seen the Loch Ness Monster in 1957, and he compared seeing Nessie to, quote, "a hole-in-one in golf. Once it happens to you, everything else seems comparatively unimportant." So Reid suggests that Harvey and Weatherspoon set up a deal in which Weatherspoon could send Harvey antique furniture from Scotland for his collection, and Harvey would promote Scottish tourism in Calgary. And this included lectures and film screenings from the St. Andrews Society and, of course, the Bruce statue. What I find particularly interesting, however, is that from my research, at least so far, people don't generally question the links between Bruce and Bannockburn and Calgary. Instead, this statue is pointed to as central evidence for this apparent connection. So, for example, in 2017, a new, rather unflattering, I would say, bronze portrait of Bruce was unveiled by the Earl of Elgin, who is a descendant of Bruce, which combined the research of Andrew Nelson, professor of anthropology at Western University in London, Ontario, with the work of forensic sculptor Christian Corbett, sculptor in residence at the Royal Canadian Navy. An article from the Sterling Smith Museum in Stirling, where the new portrait is held, mentions how this cast is the same one that Jackson used to create Bruce's head for the statues, which is interesting because they don't look that very much alike, the two statues. It goes on to say how the Bannockburn statue was made possible through the philanthropy of Harvey. The connection was also highlighted between the two statues was also highlighted in 2014 when the statue in Calgary was rededicated in honor of the 700th anniversary of Bannockburn. In a speech during the ceremony, Ian Dennis, a member of the Calgary Burns Club, said, "We have this unique linkage between Calgary and Scotland. The name Calgary is derived from a wee town on the Isle of Mull, and obviously Eric Harvey thought it was appropriate to provide that linkage." End quote. During the ceremony, a new plaque on the statue was unveiled, which was from the aforementioned Calgary Burns Club. The plaque included an excerpt from a poem by the club's namesake, Robert Burns. Scots Wha Hae, the poem, does mention Bruce and William Wallace, who was also active during the Wars of Independence and whom I'll discuss more shortly. And therefore, the statue now crosses all sorts of temporal and geographical boundaries by simultaneously celebrating the city of Calgary, its Scottish connections, the two men, Bruce and Burns, who lived more than 400 years apart, neither of which had any apparent connection to Calgary, whether in Alberta or in Scotland. In 2012, a PR and communications consultant group in Glasgow called for people looking for work in Scotland to move to Calgary. Quoting the president and CEO of the Calgary Economic Development Centre, this was the quote, I put it on the screen because it's quite long. "It really is a boom town at the moment. It's not just employment opportunities, though the overall quality of life we offer has made the city a favorite for Scottish migrants since they founded the city more than 100 years ago. A fifth of our 1 million residents claims direct Scottish ancestry, so it is a real home from home." He goes on to say, "If anyone from Stirling wanted to feel right at home in a new city, then Calgary is the place to be. We are extremely proud of our Robert the Bruce and our close Scottish connections. Donations from the people of Calgary made it possible for sculptor Pilkington Jackson to complete the iconic Robert the Bruce Bannockburn Memorial that stands at the Boarstone. Now, Calgary is calling on Stirling residents to come and help fill some of the thousands of job vacancies in the city." End quote. So in this case, the Bruce statue is potentially having a very real impact in terms of being used to partially entice people to move to another country, saying that they'd feel at home because they also have a statue of Bruce in Calgary. So on one hand, this all feels relatively harmless. If people want to celebrate their Scottish heritage by building statues, that's not objectively a problem. However, it becomes a bit more complicated when one considers how it can promote certain identity narratives over others. This includes narratives about the original settlers of the city being Scottish, rather than acknowledging that it is the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. It's also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. It also implies who can claim the most connection to the city, namely the apparent 1/5 of people with ties to Scotland in the city over other immigrant communities. So what is now the city of Calgary was originally Fort Calgary, named by a Scot, Colonel J.F. MacLeod, an official of the Northwest Mounted Police, who, according to a 1968 article discussing the statue, quote, "preserved the peace in this area in the early days," end quote. So I think this is a really good example of how the role of public monuments is tricky to unpack as we consider different viewpoints from different groups throughout history and who's represented in our current sort of series of statues that we have in the public domain. As a historian, I'm really glad to see people engaging with history and what we choose to collectively remember, rather than, as Jackson said, statues being good for nothing but looking at. I think it's good that we are engaging with them and considering the role of them in our society. Of course, the statue of Bruce in Calgary is just one example of a number of commemorations to events or figures from the Wars of Independence that can be found throughout the Scottish diaspora. So, for example, Ben Wilkie has written on this statue of William Wallace, arguably the better known figure from the Wars of Independence, which is located in Ballarat, Victoria, Australia. Wilkie's focused on the unveiling of the monument in 1889 in order to illustrate how citizens of Ballarat were showing their commitment to the Union and the British Empire with this statue. So again, they were prioritizing a connection to Scotland and to the wider British Empire at the time. Given that Wallace is famous for starting a rebellion against the English, this may seem incongruous. However, in the 19th century, commemorations were often used to reframe certain parts of Scottish history as being a necessary path towards the inevitable union between Scotland and England. This is most often known by Graham Morton's influential term, unionist nationalism. What's interesting about this statue is how it shows that this was occurring outside of Scotland as well. So Scottish emigrants were carrying their desire to show their connections to the wider narratives of Scottish history with them when they left Scotland in the 19th century. Next, I want to turn to England because it is often forgotten that there are memorials to the Wars of Independence there, though the English are the traditional antagonist in the popular story of the Wars of Independence. The first is at Smithfield in London, where a plaque marking the approximate location of Wallace's execution was placed in 1956. It was paid for by donations from people within the UK and within the Scottish diaspora, which is reinforced at the site itself, where a smaller plaque says, "This memorial was placed here by Scots and friends at home and abroad by kind permission of the governors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital and unveiled on the 8th of April, 1956. For those of you who are Scottish history buffs, the 8th of April is also the date on the Declaration of Our Birth, which is interesting and just occurred to me. Maybe it's the 6th. Anyway, we can talk about it in the questions. It's interesting that the Scots abroad are particularly mentioned rather than just referring to Scots and friends. They also make sure to mention at home and abroad. One of the most interesting things about this monument, I think, is the continuous commemoration that occurs here. There are nearly always flags and flowers that have been left by people, much as you would see at a cemetery, for example, though obviously Wallace died more than 700 years ago. In 2005, there was a ceremony at the plaque that marked the 700th anniversary of Wallace's death, which included a church service attended by 300 people that featured a specially made coffin. This was later taken to Stirling in Scotland and displayed in the National Wallace Monument before being buried in Lanarkshire, where Wallace is thought to have been born. One man, David Ross, walked 470 miles to the service in London, following the route that would have been taken by Wallace and his captors. So, though objectively this plaque describes the role played by the English crown in the execution of Wallace, in reality it's very much appropriated by a Scottish audience, which is particularly evident by the saltire flags that are continuously draped across it. There are two narratives being promoted here, acknowledgement and perhaps even regret from the English for the actions, and also an implication that what happened to Wallace remains relevant and worthy of continuous memorialization by the Scottish. Perhaps in contrast, there is a monument in Burgh by Sands in the north of England that marks the relative location of King Edward I's death, who was the King of England for about the first half of the Wars of Independence. It was built in 2007, the 700th anniversary of his death, and the monument is called the Hammer of the Scots, which was also the nickname for Edward. I think it's important to note that this statue actually faces Scotland as well. It represents the role of the English in a very different light than the plaque in London, I think, displaying pride in the aggression Edward showed rather than displaying remorse. Really quickly, I also want to mention this monument that stands nearby and is also dedicated to Edward. This version was put up in 1803, though there was originally a monument here from 1685, which was presumably in response to James VII and II replacing Charles I on the throne, showing that the politicization of monuments is by no means a new phenomenon. So I now want to come back to the title of my talk and consider how these commemorations cross boundaries. So we have the examples from Calgary and from Ballarat in Australia with the Wallace statue, where events are commemorated that occurred several thousand miles away, not to mention far removed from the medieval events that would have been occurring in these locations where the statues are now. By highlighting links to Scotland in these Commonwealth countries, I do think that it is significant, it helps people around the world feel connected to Scotland. Of course, this is manifested in a number of ways, whether interest in genealogy, wearing family tartans for special events, or participating in St. Andrew's Day or Burns Night celebrations. It has even been the central focus for the main tourist board in Scotland, which in 2014 had the theme Homecoming, leaning on the notion that there are some 50 million people worldwide who can claim Scottish ancestry. Monuments are a rather more permanent way of helping reinforce this connection, in addition to these other ways I've just mentioned. Of course, as much as these commemorations transcend the physical boundaries of Scotland, they also help reinforce them. The clearest example of this are the monuments in England, which often highlight the historic antagonism between England and Scotland. At the Wallace Monument in Smithfield in London, there are nearly always Saltire flags displayed, and in a lot of the rhetoric surrounding the ceremonies that occurred there, the focus is on the English executing Wallace rather than it being Edward, the king's decision. The statue of Edward is more overtly antagonistic. As can be seen with both the Calgary and the Ballarat statues, boundaries are also reinforced in terms of certain narratives about the establishment and settlers of locations being centered through monuments, whether that is the intention or not when they are put up. So I want to finish by coming to this quote that is the title of my paper, which comes from a TripAdvisor review of the statue of Bruce in Calgary, which says, "It's just a statue to some people. However, it is a cool and huge reminder of a rich history." The user does not elaborate on the specific history of which they speak, whether that is Bruce's role in the Wars of Independence, the history of the statue in Calgary, or indeed the connections the statue references between Calgary and Scotland. However, I hope that this brief consideration of the narrative surrounding a few statues that memorialize the medieval past show that though they may be just a statue to some people, the history and symbolism they can have very real impacts. And that is why I think commemorations should continue to be an important aspect of the study of history. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Laura, for that excellent presentation. That was absolutely fascinating. And just for everyone's benefit, after I sent the initial email announcement about your talk, one of our supporters by the name of Lisa Balfour Bowen contacted us to let her know that she was related to Eric Harvey in Calgary. So that was an interesting connection.
And it was indeed, yeah. It was great to hear from her, yeah.
So if we have any questions, folks, you can either use the chat function to ask your question, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question in person. But Laura, maybe just to get the ball rolling, is maybe on a more personal matter. How did you get involved with Scotland? You touched on it very briefly at the beginning.
Yeah, good question. So yeah, people always assume that I have sort of Scottish ancestry, which I do, but that wasn't actually what brought me to Scotland. My grandmother, who's in Saskatchewan, and it was her parents actually who immigrated from Scotland. And she actually said to me when I said I was moving here, she said, "Do you know how hard my parents worked to get us out of that place?" Was more the sentiment. But yeah, it was actually just I took a course during my undergrad at Brock, which was from Andrew MacDonald, who some of you will know, that was about the Wars of Independence, and that I was sort of hooked from there. And so then when I decided to do a master's, I decided to come over to Scotland and then did my PhD, and here we are. 10 years after I moved here. So yeah, it was just a series of things, but yeah, I would say just the interest in that kind of medieval history was the beginning point.
So Laura, do you see any messages coming out on the chat?
Yes, thank you, Joan, for your question. She said, not related to your talk, which was brilliant. Thank you very much. But which is your favorite historic site in Scotland? Mine are Callanish Stones and Stirling Castle, and maybe something else, which I'm really happy to see because Callanish and Stirling are both Historic Environment Scotland sites, so I'm really glad that they're some of your favorites. It's a really good question. I would say one of my favorites that I've been to recently was Moosa Broch in Shetland. Not easy to get to. It's an island off of the mainland in Shetland, but it's definitely the most complete broch that we have, and it is incredible. So if you ever have a chance to go, it really gives you a sense of what it must have been like to live in one of those. So that's one of my favorites for sure. I think also one of my favorites is probably Fort George, which is another Hess site, but that's just because I grew up going to sort of 18th century forts and things within Canada, and it's the only site in Scotland that I'm like, oh yes, I have a reference point for this because I've been to similar sites before rather than, medieval castles and things. So those are the two off the top of my head, but it changes week to week.
Do you see any more questions on the chat? I'm on an iPad, so it's a little bit tricky.
Not in the chat, but I think that Donald might have a hand up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harrison, for that fascinating talk. First of all, I should mention my credentials. I was born in Skye, and my first degree is from Edinburgh, though I've lived in Toronto most of my life. Now, I guess I have two questions, but I'll ask the first one. Have you noticed any, can we say, unifying or common or constant pattern or trend in Canada, when in the diaspora in Canada, when such material memorials are brought to or raised in this country? Is there anything in common? I mean, for many Scots, anything to do with Robert Burns is important. For others, the sweet sting of the malt is very important. So that's a very broad, loose question, and it's a genuine question because I have no idea what the answer might be.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think that in terms of sort of historic figures, I think that Burns certainly, and then I do think that you get a certain amount of Bruce and William Wallace in there as well. And then, as I mentioned briefly, the Declaration of Arbroath, I think, is something else that gets brought up a lot. That is the basis for Tartan Day, which is Canada is a holiday, not a public holiday, but is a holiday in Canada, and Tartan Week in America is that's the basis for that. And then otherwise, I think it is lots of what you would expect in terms of, the whiskey and when you can get it, haggis on Burns Night and that sort of thing. Yeah, those are the things that sort of come to mind. But yeah, I'm going to reflect on that. That is a really interesting question. And you said you had a second question?
Yes, my second question has to do more broadly with the work of Historic Environment Scotland. Now, I remember the first time I went to Duntelvy, an amazing broch near Glenelg in the West Highlands of Scotland. And there's another broch very nearby. Is that part of the remit of a HEC to look after such significant elements of the built environment, shall we say?
Yeah, Duntrodden is the one that's nearby there, and yeah, they are part of Hess's sites indeed. And so sorry, can you repeat the question again?
I'm basically asking if that is part of what the looks after, that sort of piece of the built environment, in this case from the Iron Age.
Indeed. Yeah, so yeah, they are, as they are Hess sites, and yeah, we span span the ages. I think that Skara Brae is our oldest site, but it is always a question of what's the oldest and what's the newest. Some of the newer ones are Dallas Dew, which is a distillery, and some parts of Stanley Mills, which is a mill in Perthshire, are also relatively new in terms of the date that they were built as well. So yeah, we span all of the times that there is something left from the built environment and things that are also still buried archaeology as well. So it's a big remit in terms of, in my role, of knowing sort of different parts of it. And luckily I have, archaeologist colleagues and things who can help with the Iron Age and Bronze Age and Neolithic sites as well.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
You mentioned the standing stones at Callanish,
Mm-hmm.
which are quite remarkable, of course. And it brought to mind a smaller stone circle at Clava near Inverness, where I went to high school. Is there anything special about the Clava stones?
Oh, good question. You're really all ticking all the boxes in terms of all the Hess sites. So yeah, Clava Cairns is another Hess site. I wish that one of my colleagues was here because we recently updated. So each of the sites have a statement of significance, which are freely available online. So you can all access them. But yeah, one of my colleagues recently updated the statement for Clava, and it's 60 pages now or something, sort of with all of the new research on it. So I would definitely direct you to there. I'll try to find the link and put it in the chat if I can. Because yeah, there's lots there in terms of what we think the various placements of the stones means. And then the cairns, some of them have carved stones that are sort of part of the cairns that are there as well. So yeah, there's, as I say, I wish I could speak to it more, but yeah, would highly recommend going there. I'll try to find the link for you just now.
Am I allowed one more?
Yeah, as long as David says that's okay, that's fine by me.
Okay.
Also near Inverness, of course, is the site of the Battle of Culloden. And the site has been doctored quite extensively. But one item, one feature, is the so-called Cumberland Stone, which used to be much more prominent, but now is sort of concealed in the area. It is a single item like that, Cumberland Stone, in which the Duke of Cumberland is supposed to have stood observing and commanding the battle. Is that something that HEC looks after?
So you've touched on one that's not us. So it's the National Trust for Scotland has Culloden. And so yeah, I know the stone that you speak of, but I can't speak to sort of how it's being cared for or anything, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat, David. Shall I read that out? Oh, there's two, I think.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. There's
Perfect.
one from Ian Anderson. Is that the one you see?
Yes, and then there's one before that from Gillian.
Okay,
So-
go ahead.
So Gillian asked, Scottish regiments in Canada, in spite of many of their soldiers and officers not being Scots, work at maintaining Scottish heritage. One such example would be that although the London Scottish has been absorbed into a Guards regiment and has given up the Hodden Grey, it will be perpetuated in the Toronto Scottish, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother's Own. To what degree might that help to support Scottish heritage in Scotland? Are expat Scots more concerned with sustaining heritage? That's such a good point, Gillian. Yeah, the Scottish regiments are a huge part of maintaining that Scottish heritage and sort of what we think of in terms of Scotland. And your question about are expat Scots more concerned with sustaining heritage, I think really hits the nail on the head, because I always say that I think that there's a separate Scottish identity. There's a Scottish identity of people who are Scottish in Scotland, and then there's a Scottish identity of people who identify as Scottish outside of Scotland. And I think that both of those are very valid, and both of them are very worthy of us of sort of continuing and developing, but I do think that they're quite different. So I think that expat Scots are really concerned with sustaining their sort of Scottish identity as they see it, and I think that's really important. I do think that it's easier when you're just sort of day to day living in a place, you don't think as much about sustaining the heritage. I think people do in Scotland just because of that historical antagonism with England and things. I think people are aware of maintaining a Scottish identity and hold on to that. But I think expat Scots sort of even above that, or, you know, people with Scottish ancestry and things. So it's something that I always say I'd like to study more, is that sort of idea of Scotland outside of Scotland, because I find it so interesting. So yeah, thank you. Right. Ian Anderson asked, the current enthusiasm for defacing or even removing historic statues represented in Canada by those of Prime Minister MacDonald is perhaps something we're studying. Definitely. Yeah, thank you, Ian. I completely agree. I think those of us who study commemoration, our subject area, I used to have to convince people that it was important, but I don't really anymore. So there's certainly lots of people who are studying it, and it's certainly something that I want to continue looking at as well, because I think it's really interesting what's happening in different areas and why it's happening and what people are doing. So yes, I completely agree, worth studying, and I'm intrigued to see how that study goes over the next few years, and also what happens with statues and things over the next few years. We've got one more question from Paul, who said, would you agree that expats are more passionate about their heritage than the Indigenous Scots? And yeah, this touches on what I was saying before, but I think yes. In a way, as I said, I think it's a bit different, and probably Scottish people would disagree with me on that. But I think that there is sort of a passion that I think is different from from Scots who live in Scotland. So I would agree with you. But as I said, not everyone might agree with my answer. Oh, perfect. The questions are coming in now. So we've got one from Rupert, who said, it really depends where you are in Scotland. I've noticed the north of the lowlands, people have a stronger interest in the clans and their history than, say, closer to the borders. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I would definitely agree with that. And I think, I mean, the borders changed hands so many times over the years that might be part of it. And I also think if you look at somewhere like Shetland and Orkney and the Outer Hebrides have really distinctive sort of identities as well. So I think that's a very good point. That really depends on where you are. So yes, lovely. I think that's it for the chat for now.
Okay, that's good. Just a question from me again. Laura, what are you working on at present?
Oh, good question. With my role at Hess, or sort of on a research side of things?
In your job with Hess.
Good question. So I'm working on a few different things. I'm working on some new interpretation at that mill that I mentioned, Stanley Mills in Perthshire. So if anyone's looking to visit there, not at the moment, but in the future, there should be an update to the exhibition that's there. I'm working on some works that are happening at Fort George, which I already mentioned, as well, in terms of maintaining the sea wall, because the sea just wants to knock down stonework. So trying to make sure that that wall holds, which is always important. And then I've been working on, oh gosh, what else? Now it's all going out of my head. But yeah, those are the things off the top of my head, David. I'm sure there's many things that I'm not thinking of.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating job you've managed to get yourself across there.
It is, yeah. No, I feel very lucky to be doing it.
It's absolutely wonderful. Well, listen, I think we've come to probably the end of the session, unless anybody has any other questions. But Laura, on behalf of us all at the Scottish Studies Foundation, thank you so much for joining us today and letting us know all about that research you've been doing. We've learned a lot from you, and it's absolutely fascinating. And if you, at some point in the future, have some other talk that you could give to us, some other topic, we would be delighted to hear from you.
Oh, lovely. I will keep that in mind. David, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful. And thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. And to everyone else for joining us, thank you so much for giving your part of your weekend to us. It's so nice to have your company. And have a nice day. Thank you very much. Goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.